Hello and welcome to the October presentation of the Nutritionist 2019. I am Marianne Fessenden from AMTS. We're glad to be back with a great webinar on a slightly different topic this month. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our format is to deliver a recorded presentation 2 times on the webinar day, with the presenter joining at the end of each session to answer questions from the listening audience. I also pre-record the introductions and ending credits to minimize risk of technical difficulties, so I may not have the most up-to-date information regarding co-hosts. These educational webinars are multinational. I have several co-hosts who join to deliver the presentations translated into their country's language and field questions from their countrymen. Paula Turillo from Argentina has been a constant contributor since the beginning of the series in 2015 and assists in planning the webinars. Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia in Italy is a regular co-host, as is Sean Lee of AnsciTech in China. When he can, Marcos Neves Pereira of Universidade Federal de Lavras in Brazil joins us for the Portuguese audience. Our potential panelists include Vadim Bekchemnikov of Novolab Russia and Marcelo Ramos of 3R Lab in Brazil. While some of the co-hosts may not be able to rebroadcast in their own language, their questions give an opportunity for consideration of viewpoints of concerns in different farming systems. Depending on how you are listening, you could submit queries through me or one of my attending co-hosts. Later, a complete recording of archived webinars as well as a question and answer session for each will be available on the AMTS website. For those of you who would listen to the presentations whilst driving, we have converted the videos to MP3 files that can be downloaded for offline listening. Those podcasts can be found at the Ag Model Systems website under the Webinar tab or Resources tab. Here in the United States, and I'm sure around the world, there's much discussion and controversy about the role animal agriculture may play in increasing greenhouse gases and environmental pollutants that contribute to climate change. We are very pleased today to host Dr. Michel Wattiaux of the University of Wisconsin-Madison as our speaker addressing this topic. Dr. Wattiaux is from Belgium, and for a brief time between getting his master's and PhD was a dairy farmer there. He obtained his PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He joined the UW staff as a research associate. He has been busy in various departments at UW, having served as co-director of the Babcock Institute for International Research and Development, and is on the faculty of 3 schools within UW: the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, the School of Human Ecology, and the Department of Dairy Science. He is also the director for the Center of Integrated Agricultural Systems. In the last 19 years, he has taught more than 1,500 students. He has been a Fulbright Scholar and is a recipient of numerous awards and honors, among the most recent being the North American Colleges and Teachers of Agriculture Educator Award. We are very happy he could take time to talk with us today. His topic is mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farms, the cow, the manure, and the field. Please now enjoy his presentation. Remember to jot down any questions you have during the presentation and type them in the Q&A window. We will have an opportunity for Dr. Wattiaux to answer those questions after this presentation. So at this point, I'll turn over the recording to Dr. Wattiaux. Thank you.
This presentation will focus on mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farms, focusing on the cow, the manure, and the field. I am Michel Wattiaux from the University of Wisconsin. I am a dairy nutritionist in the Department of Dairy Science, and I want to acknowledge my collaborator Randy Jacksons from the Agronomy Department and Rebecca Larsons from the Biological System Engineering Department, who've contributed to the section on the field and the manure emission, respectively. So let's start with an idea of the milk carbon footprint, the different greenhouse gases emitted in the process of the production, processing, transportation, and consumption of milk. The work that really put greenhouse gas emission on the map here in the United States is the work of Thoma that was published in 2013. And what he basically showed was that in the United States, for every kilos of milk consumed, there is an average of a 2.05 kilos of CO2 equivalent with a 90% confidence interval from 1.8 to 2.4. Overall, in the United States, the dairy sector contributes about 1.9% of all the greenhouse gas emitted by the country. This number can vary quite substantially across different nations. So here is a breakdown of the total teragrams of emissions for the dairy sector in the United States, with the feed production, milk production, processing, packaging, transportation, retail, and consumers. And we see that most of the emission comes from the level of the milk production by the cows in the barns, or the manure in the farms, or the field, which is the emission for the production of the feeds. We see that the field contribute 90% of the total, manure 24%, and cow 25%. So in other words, we have a lot of emission coming from methane from the cow, which you see here is expressed as kilo CO2 equivalent per milk consumed. And so the methane from the cow is the single most important component, followed by the emission associated with the manure, most of it being in the form of methane, but some of it also in the form of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is also emitted substantially in the process of producing the feed in the field. And so CO2, which in this case is really the CO2 primarily from the combustion of fossil fuel, is also a great component, but primarily outside of the farm. Inside the farm, we see that CO2 is associated with the utilization of mechanical equipment associated with the production and storage and the feeding of the animal. Again, the fuel in the tractors, basically. So on the farm, the emission is about 72% of the total emission. So only 28% of the emission associated with the consumption of milk come from outside the farm. So which is the reason why a lot of studies and work have been put on studying reduction of emission within the farms. So now let's focus on the cow and the enteric emission from the cow. Some meta-analyses that have been recently published indicated that the emission is really associated with the energy intake. In this case here, the gross energy intake. The more energy intake the cow has, the greater the methane emission of those cows. However, there is also an effect of the composition of the diet, where NDF, on the one hand, as its concentration increase in the diet, we're going to have more emission in the form of methane. This is illustrated by the plus sign here in this equation. And the more ether extract or the more fat we have in the ration, the less methane we should be expecting. This is indicated by the negative sign in these equations. So it's total amount of dry matter intake, but also the composition of the dry matter may have an influence on total methane emission. This work here that I want to show you is an unpublished work that we have worked on, and we basically induce subacute ruminal acidosis with the idea that cows with lower ruminant pH would have lower emission, which is being suggested by work done in vitro. I want to simply draw your attention to what happened when the cow were being challenged and the rumen pH dropped due to the fact that we basically make those cows eat a lot of grains after we starve them for a day. And you see that when there is a reduction in the methane, in the ruminal pH, there was also a corresponding decrease in the methane emission. And then as the rumen recovered its normal pH, then we see a recovery of the change in methane emission. In other words, this data, which we hopefully will be published soon, indicated that rumen pH is a primary determinant of methane emission in dairy cows. So this slide is really to draw your attention to what we mean when we talk about methane emissions. So there is methane production, which is the amount of methane produced in a unit of time, typically a day. But we in nutrition oftentimes measure the consumption of feed from the animal, the dry matter intake as a kilo per day. And so we can basically divide the methane production by the feed consumption, and we have methane yield, expressed as gram of methane per kilo of dry matter intake. Nutritionists also measure production, oftentimes standardized the production for the composition of the milk, expressed as energy-corrected milk. And now we divide the emission by the kilos of milk produced by the cow. We have what is referred to as methane intensity, the gram of methane per kilos of milk. A lot of people have put a lot of emphasis on reducing the intensity, but obviously if you are an IPCC scientist looking at reduction of total emission, maybe you should be more focused on the methane production than the methane intensity. Here is a summary of some of the work that we've done and published a few years ago looking at the effect of forage versus concentrate in the diet. And what you see is that when you increase the forage proportion in the diet, you increase the methane production, you increase the methane yield, and you increase the methane intensity linearly. A work that we've done later, looking at the proportion of alfalfa silage and corn silage in the diet, gave a little more complex picture because now the results were quadratic. So when we increased the proportion of alfalfa silage at the expense of corn silage in the ration, there was a zone in the middle when we have about 40-60 or 60-40, where we had the greatest amount of emission per day, the greatest yield, and the greatest intensity. So indicating that there is complex relationship taking place, and maybe instead of looking at the emission associated with single feeding region, we should be looking at the emission associated with certain type of diets fed to the cows. Feed additive is another way to reduce the emission from the cows, and there's a lot of work done by a lot of different industries to try to find additive that will reduce emission. One of the most talked about in the recent years is 3-nitrooxypropanol, 3-NOP, which you can see, here reduce substantially the amount of methane, whether we had 40, 60, or 80 milligrams in the ration dry matter. Back now to looking at the efficiency of the cow as opposed to looking at the ration of the cow. So to what extent this efficiency can really help us reduce the emission from the cow? So this is a work that we published in 2013, and we basically had cows grouped in high efficiency or low efficiency based on phenotypic observation. So this was not genetic prediction, it was a phenotypic measurement of efficiency, kilos of milk divided by kilo dry matter intake. And what you see here is that the cow of low efficiency produced greater amount of methane per kilos of forage NDF digested than cows in high efficiency, 184 grams versus 147 grams. And that difference in methane emission per kilos of NDF digested in the digestive tract was associated with a greater presence of Methanobrevibacter species, which are species known to be producers of methane. So our low efficiency cows may have produced more methane because of the type of microbes that existed in the rumen, which is different than the population of microbes that existed in the rumen in the high efficiency cow. So clearly there is something that needs to be pursued here in studying the microbiomes of the rumen ecosystems and how it may influence methane emission. What we also found, which is not completely surprising, is that our high efficiency cows are cows that eat a lot, and therefore the rate of passage is greater, and the result of that, they have a greater loss of fecal energy, and so they have a lower digestible energy than the low energy cows. So high efficiency cows were actually lower digestive efficiency than the low efficiency cows. However, those high phenotypic efficiency cows compensated for the lower digestible energy with greater efficiency associated with metabolic processes. And so there was less energy in the urine of those cows, there was less methane energy released by those cows, and apparently there were less heat released by those cows. And so they had greater energy available for production of milk. So this is, again, gives us kind of the idea that it's not going to be a silver bullet of one solution fit all, but that we're going to have to work on the different parts of the metabolizable energy of the animal to reduce the methane from those animals. So now let's look at manure as a source of greenhouse gases in dairy systems. And we're going to be talking about emission of methane and emission of nitrous oxide. First of all, I want to point out that an average dairy cow, 635 kilos, would produce on a yearly basis about 25 tons of manure each year. 160 kilos of nitrogen, 18 kilos of phosphorus, 118 kilos of phosphate. This actually is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that would serve the needs of 1 hectare of corn. There is obviously a lot of factors that influence how much NPK is required for 1 hectare of corn, but the idea is there that a cow can produce in her manure the amount of NPK that's required by 1 hectare of corn. What the manure gives also that the inorganic fertilizer does not is more than 2,000 kilos of organic matter that's being returned into the soil, which agronomy people are telling us is very critical for soil fertility, for water retention, and for possibly accumulation of carbon in the soil in the long run. So we really need to pay attention to manure and its management as a possible contributor to the practices that help us reduce the emission from the farm. So most of the emission during the manure management chains doesn't happen during collection or during the processing, but primarily during storage, primarily if that storage is, whether that storage actually is in the form of liquid or solid. And during storage, depending on the aerobic or anaerobic condition, we'd have a balance between methane emission or nitrous oxide emission. In absence of oxygen, we're going to see a lot of methane emission. In presence of oxygen, we're going to see more nitrous oxide emission. The work done by Becky Larson and her team indicated that the CO2 equivalent release per ton of manure going to be reduced substantially when the manure is processed and is subjected to solid liquid separation. AD in this slide referred to anaerobic digestion, and the third column here represented a combination from applying solid liquid separation and anaerobic digestion. And basically the message of this slide is that we have a substantial reduction of emission of greenhouse gas from the manure if you separate the liquid from the solid, about 20% reduction. But if you apply anaerobic digestion, you see that you reduce the emission by about 47, 48% compared to not doing the anaerobic digestion or both be combined. When, so in other words, these numbers are the one you saw in the previous slide. You have in the baseline 101.2 kilos of CO2 equivalent release during the manure management change. If you apply the liquid separation, you reduce by 19% and 48% through anaerobic digestion. If now you look at the depletion of fossil fuel, you're going to utilize more fossil fuel. if you do the liquid solid separation, because you have to run those electric motors to separate the manure. However, you're still very positive for the total reduction of fossil fuel, because now you produce methane that can reduce the need for electricity in the grid substantially. The problem with the anaerobic digestion, however, is that it makes the nitrogen in the manure less suitable and more susceptible to environment loss, because you have an increase in ammonia in ammonia production in the manure slurry, and a lot of that ammonia is going to be volatilized prior to being taken up by the plant. So the manure of a digested manure is a plant available nitrogen that's less desirable than if you don't apply the anaerobic digestion. In terms of the energy, also, anaerobic digestion provide a big win-win situation. You have here two different measures of the efficiency of utilization of the energy, and you see that for an electric grid, about 27 or 29%, depending on the calculation, of the energy, usable energy from the total energy into the process, whereas anaerobic digestions give you much, much greater efficiency of the utilization of energy at the farm level. So it seems like anaerobic digestion can really be providing a lot of positive contribution, not only in terms of reducing the emissions, but also making the farm a lot more energy efficient overall. So this is another work from the group of Becky Larson again, where she basically look at different combination of housing system, collection systems, processing systems of the manure, surface application versus injection of the manure, and the long-term versus the short-term storage of manure. And they basically, through a survey, try to identify the most frequent combination of manure management chain. And the thickness of the arrow on this very complicated slide give you an idea of the most common combination of housing, collection systems, processing application, and storage. And so what you see, this is another way to look at the data here, is that when you go from small farms to medium, large, and the very large farm, the permitted cows with more than 1,000 cow, you see a shift from solid manure to liquid manure storage systems. And this is going to have a big implication in terms of the total emission of greenhouse gas, but also what kind of greenhouse gas is being emitted. When it's solid manure, it's an aerobic environment, and you're going to have a lot more nitrous oxide emission. And if it's a liquid manure, you have an anaerobic environment, and you're going to have a lot more of methane emission in that situation. So here is then they applied some of the existing tool to look at the greenhouse gas emission per kilos of manure, the small, the large, and the very large farms. And what you see in this slide for the A, B, and C, it doesn't refer to statistical differences, but it refers simply to emitting scenarios, with the B being a reference scenario, A being low emitting and high, and the C, I'm sorry, being high emitting scenarios. So what you see here is that in the small farm, the greenhouse gas emission from the manure is lower than in the large farm, but most of this emission, as indicated in the green bar here, is associated with the field application of manure to produce the feed for the cows on those farms, and most of this emission is in the form of nitrous oxide. In the large farm, you see the majority of the emission is associated with the storage, the blue bar here, and that storage is causing a lot of methane emission. The nitrous oxide, the green portion associated with the field emission, is relatively small. And as indicated in a previous slide, for the very large farm, those who can afford to process and apply the anaerobic digestion, you see that they're going to be able to claim a lot of greenhouse gas credits, in other words, a reduction in credits. Those are the purple bar, in amount that actually are greater than the amount of greenhouse gas emitted associated with the field emission, the storage, and the transportation of that manure to the field. So again, one more time, anaerobic digestion seems to really provide a great amount of benefits to the entire systems. So now look at the field emission, and we're going to be talking about nitrous oxide and the emission of carbon dioxide. And so a recent literature review published by a German scientist looked at the driver of greenhouse gas emission from the soil. And the first and most important thing to realize is that you're going to have a lot of local and regional variation associated with climates, hydrology, and the type of soils. Some of those drivers are associated with the land use. So the transformation of the land from one use to a different use will influence the emission over time. The land cover, and in this case, we talk of, grassland versus cropland versus wetland versus forest land. They all have distinct emission. The type of vegetation, young vegetation, late growth vegetation, the amount of leaf related to stem in the type of vegetation will influence the emission from the soil. The nutrient in the soil, in particular, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, is a critical factor that's going to influence tremendously the amount of nitrous oxide that's going to be emitted from the field. And then the humidity, the soil, the water in the soil, the more water in the soil, obviously the less air in the soil. So that water content in the soil is going to have a big influence on the proportion of oxygen available for the metabolic processes in the soil, and it's going to influence the amount of nitrous oxide that's going to be released. And finally, the temperature is another driver of the greenhouse gas emission from the soil. Notice that from those emission sources, the farmer doesn't have really control over a lot of them, except maybe for the carbon-nitrogen ratio that could be altered in the long run with the application of manure, as I indicated before, and the amount of nutrients available to the soil by the application of chemical fertilizer. So here's the work now from Randy Jackson. And so here what you see is the nitrous oxide emission as N2O per kilo per hectares under different cropping systems. And so the main lesson here is that, as you can tell from looking at the graph and the blue text, that annual monoculture results in much greater emission of nitrous oxide than perennial monoculture, and perennial polyculture are actually the type of cropping system that yield the least amount of nitrous oxide emission. So as they indicated in their findings, the author indicated that unfertilized land will release much less nitrous oxide emission than fertilized land overall. So they also indicated that the weather conditions have a big influence on the nitrous oxide emission and the peaks of emission over time. Typically, you're going to have a peak of N2 emission after a precipitation event, so after rainfall. The soil type is an important factor that's going to influence nitrous oxide emission. The type of rotations that is on the field will have an effect, and in general, more diverse rotation will reduce nitrous oxide emission. And the amount of fertilizer applied also will have a big effect on the nitrous oxide emission. With the least fertilizer applied, the least fertilization, the least emission will be observed. Here's a different work that I think was very interesting, because now we look at the effect of the livestock on the pasture. And so we have looking at the nitrous oxide emission, micrograms per square meter per hour, under experimental management intensive rotational grazing systems, that the top row of the top line of data. On-farm management intensive rotational grazing, there were 8 farms in this study, continuous grazing, harvest, or no management of the land at all. And you can see the difference in spread and the position of the average of those emissions. And so the lesson is relatively straightforward, that grazing management influence the nitrous oxide emission. The rainfall also in this study influenced the emission, with peaks of emission after the rainfall. And based on this data, the least management practice you apply to the field, the least emission you have. And as a little provocatively here, if you want to remove all emissions, it seems like you should be stopping to have animal on the land. But then you kind of wonder, what are you going to do with all this pasture if you leave it there? Okay, so now I want to move to the results of what's referred to as the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, or WISC. This is a set of experimental plot in our research station here at the University of Wisconsin. It's 60 acres of land that has been divided into replicated plots with different cropping systems, and almost 30 years of data have been collected in terms of productivity of the land and environmental parameters. So here is a layout of the design of the WISC. We have 6 different rotation systems, from monoculture of corn, which is cropping system 1, to cropping system 6, which is basically rotational grazing of heifers on pasture. We have 2 organic systems, a corn, soybean, clover, the number 3, and we have a corn, oat, alfalfa cropping rotation system, number 5. And the top 3 crop rotations are grain rotation primarily, whereas the bottom 3 are rotation that you would see in Wisconsin on farms that have dairy cows, and so those are referred to as dairy forage rotation systems. So again, we go from very simple to very complex rotation, and from annual to more perennial rotation as we go from left to right and from top to bottom. Here is the emission over 29 years of data. And so A are the embedded emission associated with all the work that needs to be done prior to even harvesting the material from the field. So it's the diesel, the drying, the fertilizing, the manure, emission associated with the manure brought to the field, the emission associated with the manufacturing, the transport, the utilization of pesticide and seeds. So those are the emission prior to establishment of the crop. The in-field emission are the emission associated with what happened during the growing season and after the growing season. So we have emission associated with the residue that's left on the field, associated with the actual application of the manure, and the indirect emissions associated with the leaching of material or the volatilization of gases from the fields. And the third part here is this A and B are built in C here. So A, embedded emissions are in brown in this central graph. The the in-field emission, B, is now represented in green, and the third component, soil organic matter, is in blue. So what you see is that for the grain systems, there is a lot of loss of soil organic matter, which indicate that there is a lot of CO2 loss from primarily the grain systems, but there is also quite a bit of loss of CO2 from the organic matter of the soil in forage systems, although those loss seems to be less than in grain systems. The rotation systems with the least amount of CO2 emission was the pasture systems. You see that there's still some loss in that situation for CS6. So the bottom line is that regardless of cropping system in southern Wisconsin, is very important to emphasize, this is for southern Wisconsin, regardless of the cropping system, all the soils will be emitting CO2. However, the rate of CO2 emission will vary considerably among cropping systems. Okay, so now finally, let's try to put this all together, looking at the work where real-world systems were studied and where the effect of the cow, the manure, and the field were all put together. So we're basically looking here at life cycle analysis done on farms. So I want to first start with the work done in Europe. Most of this actually will be done in Europe, comparing New Zealand graze-based systems with Swedish indoor mixed systems. I reproduced here the graph that were used in those publications to highlight the system under consideration. And what I want to highlight is that a model is a model of the reality. The model is not the reality. And so we need to really understand what is included in the model and what is not included in the model, and what kind of prediction equations are being used in each of those models. But in any case, in this, you can see that the New Zealand system had an emission of 1 kilos of CO2 per kilos of energy-corrected meal versus a 1.16 kilos of CO2 in the case of the indoor mixed ration systems of Sweden. What I really want to point out of this publication is actually that average may be hiding a more complex reality. And you see the coefficient of variation in New Zealand was about 26%, and the coefficient of variation in Sweden was about 16%. The lowest emitter farm in New Zealand was 0.6, and the greater emitters were around 1.5 kilos of CO2 per kilos of milk. And you see also a wide range of emission in the Swedish system. So what we should be doing, I think, as consultant or scientists, is trying to understand why do we have some of the farms, what kind of practice exists in the low emitting farms, and what kind of practice exists in the high emitting farm, to really understand how at the system level we can limit the emission of the milk produced in those farms. Here's the work done in Germany, where the idea was to compare intensive to extensive and organic grassland systems. And if you're hopefully familiar with the amoeba graph, you see that the intensive system is deemed less sustainable because of a lower surface area than the extensive, which itself is less sustainable than the organic, because the organic, the light gray area, take a greater surface area of the entire amoeba graph. However, what I want to point out here is that this graph was done by agronomists when they basically express their emissions or different indicators like energy use or nutrient balance in the farm per hectares. So that actually shows the bias that scientists have to look at the world through the lens of their discipline. And so agronomists will tend to look at things on a per hectare basis, and animal scientists will tend to look at things in terms of per cow. So the question remains, what should be the denominator when we look at those effects? So, but the other point I think that's important from this work was that the authors indicated that renouncing to the use of mineral fertilizer in the case of organic producers had multiple effects. It was not just a reduction of the nitrogen use in the farm, but that also had substantial effect on the reduction of energy use and a reduction in global warming potential of the system, as well as a reduction of negative effect on water, on groundwater. So changing one practice can have an impact on multiple indicators of environmental sustainability. And again, the question when you build those amoeba graph is, how do you establish the scale and the reference data or the limit values or the critical values that you need to decide what's good or bad or kind of in between. Okay, so they also indicated by the end of their paper that there is aspect of those evaluations that cannot be 100% quantitative, and some people will have to bring some expertise and educated guess, if I can use that word, to help people come to some sort of consensus about some of those negative impact. Okay, so now we look at the work done again in Sweden, where they compare organic to conventional. And basically this slide is trying to point out that something that's, I think by now pretty well established, that organic may give you some advantage in terms of CO2 equivalent per kilos of milk, less energy use on the farm, a substantial reduction in surplus nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on the farm compared to a conventional farm. However, the organic system required a much greater surface area of land to produce a certain amount of milk compared to the conventional farms. So what value do you give to land area? What value do you give to energy consumption? What value do you give to surplus of nutrient on the farm? These are questions that I think are still unresolved. Here's a French work, and I think we're getting to the end of our exploration of a publication now. I like this publication because it looked at the life cycle analysis across the systems and the practice within the system. So we look at two things here: different management practices, and there are a lot of different of them that have been looked at here in this study. And we also look at the degree of intensification of the system. And so here is the results where we had 7 systems, from organic to low intensive grass-based to intensive grass-based to low intensive corn silage system, intensive corn silage system, and very intensive corn silage system. And then the 7th system was a high land, a very extensive production systems. And you see here the CO2 emission per kilos of milk for each of those systems and per hectares for each of those systems. What I want to highlight here is that in both, whether you use milk or hectares for the denominator, organic provide you with the lowest emission in both cases. However, if you look at the highland systems, the most extensive of all the systems, it provides you the second lowest emission per unit of land, but the highest emission per unit of milk. So the ranking will differ depending on the units that you're using to assess your environmental impact. Kind of the similar story for the low intensive corn, which would be the second lowest emitter per unit of milk, but would be the second highest emitter if you express the result per ton, per hectares of land. So the functional unit is very important in order to determine what's best or what's worst. So the recommendation of those authors is that to use multiple indicators, multiple functional units when we do assessment of greenhouse gas emission from farms. Okay, so the future is a way to wrap up and finish this presentation. Again, going back to where I started now, but instead of looking at the US milk carbon footprint, we look at work done in Europe. And so we see here the CO2 equivalent per kilos of milk. Most of it happens on farms. Only 20% happens off of the farm. What I want to point out, however, is that this European work done give us, again, a pretty good indication of the range, with some of the farms in this study being as low as 0.4 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilos of milk, and others, the maximum being a 1.8 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilos of milk. So you see that there is 25% of the population of farms that are, very high or very low, basically. And so we need to focus our attention, I believe, in the future to those practices on real farms where they are low or where they are high, to identify the best practices. Now, I still think that life cycle analysis is kind of a work in progress. As I try to highlight in this presentation, when we talk about milk carbon footprint and life cycle analysis, what should be the denominator? Should there be a denominator to begin with? If the ultimate goal is actually to reduce the amount of gas produced, the amount of milk doesn't matter. It should be just the amount of gas that we should be looking at. However, if we want to focus on just the reduction in intensity, we know by past experience that it's going to be easier for us to try to continue to increase the kilos of milk, the denominator, than to try to reduce the numerator, the CO2 equivalent produced per day. And so the direction of the future would be then to continue increase milk production in order to reduce the intensity. But is this really the way that we want to go? So functional unit is very important. Should it be the milk, the cow, the hectares, maybe the human edible nutrients? This is still a very open questions. System boundaries, I tried to raise the questions. What is the limit of the systems? How do we allocate emissions? When you produce milk on the farm, you also produce meat. And in Europe in particular, a lot of the meat consumed by the European market comes from the dairy. In the US, it's a little less, but still a large contribution of the meat consumed in the US is actually coming from the dairy sector. So how do we allocate the emission to the beef and the dairy is still an open questions. And then there is another thing that I think that's important is that we tend to look at dairy farmers specialized, looking at just milk as the unique cropping output. However, work done in Canada in particular has highlighted the fact that many farms in Quebec in particular also export cereal crops, another output. So it's not just the milk or the meat, but also the animal product relative to a crop product from the farm that can be exported. I know for facts that in southern Wisconsin, we also have a lot of large dairy farms that are also managing a lot of lands, and they do produce corn or soybean or other cereal crops that can be sold for the human food chain. So we need to look at those farms as a whole instead of just looking at the dairy component of those farms. Okay, so one of the final slides here. So the future, I think, is that we need to really try to think in two different ways. One, we can continue the work making our producer more efficient, and this is the kind of quantitative modeling of the sources and the drivers of emission and the factors that affect those emissions, and continue build model that are ever more precise and solvable based on the hard science of discovering factors that influence the emission, the source of emission, and how we can use factors that influence those sources to reduce those emissions. That's one way to make the producer more efficient on the one hand. I don't think, however, that the consumer are very interested in all those details. The consumer just basically wants to feel good about what they do, and as indicated in the work published by the group in Wageningen just last year, we need to contextualize the dairy systems and the livestock systems into how they help contribute to a better society as a whole. And so now this is more a slippery slope for people, because we're talking of something that's not solvable through systems of equations, but something that's referred by social scientists as a wicked problem, where we need to be more inclusive of people's choice and value in trying to find the optimal solution to the problem. So the fact that our consumers are very concerned about animal welfare needs to be addressed, right? The fact that our consumers are concerned about greenhouse gas emission means that we need to address greenhouse gas emissions. However, we can also highlight to our consumer how the livestock industry help recycle a lot of the non-human edible product from the food, human food chain. So there's a lot of education work that would need to be done if we take a more social approach to going forward in the future. And I really think that we need to go both forward as we go down the road in the future, having solvable problems that rely on hard science, but also have value-based discussions about people's choice and value as we move forward in the future. And so I want to thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and concerns and to address them in the second phase of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michel, for that presentation. I hope you all have had a chance to think of some questions to ask after I introduce our next month's speaker and thank this series sponsors. Next month, we will host Mr. Michael Deneen. He hasn't quite got his doctor degree yet. He is a Cornell PhD candidate. Mike was raised on a pasture-raised dairy farm in County Cork, Ireland. In 2014, he received his BS in Animal Science from the University College Dublin. He also holds a Master of Philosophy from Queen's University, Belfast. In April 2017, Mike became a ruminant nutritionist scientist with Teagasc Moorpark, who are an Irish government body involved in research, education, and extension. Along with the research appointment, Mike will teach multiple courses for a newly established Bachelor's of Agricultural Science degree at the University College Cork. Currently a fifth-year PhD student in the lab of Dr. Michael Van Amberg, Mike focuses on describing nutrient supply and animal requirements in pasture-based systems, along with evaluation and development of the CNCPS. As with this webinar, there will be two opportunities to join. In the United States, we switch back to standard time. For that reason, the webinar will be shown at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As you know, these webinars take a lot of work and cooperation. The webinars are organized and produced by AMTS USA and Global. Our longtime collaborator is Paula Torillo of Afina. She hosts the series as El Webinar del Nutritionista. She receives support from Tecnal, Venus Claudin, Guillermo Lerman, and RR Lab in Argentina. She also has the excellent translation skills of Paula Alanis backing her up. Paula hosted last month's webinar, if you remember. Several of our distributors in Italy, Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia, China, Sean Lee of Ansitech, Brazil, Marcelo Hens Ramos, director of 3R Lab, and in Russia, Vadim Bakhtemnikov of Novolab, all join us regularly to co-host and supply questions. We are especially thankful to generous sponsors who make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Arm & Hammer Animal Health, makers of cattle feed ingredients that optimize dairy cow health. Our silver sponsors are Ajinomoto Heartland, superior nutrition through amino acids, makers of AgiPro L, Dairyland Laboratories, Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA, DHA omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s, Dairy One Forage Laboratory, and Jeffo, Life Made Easier. Our bronze sponsors are AminoMax, Purdue Agribusiness, Adiseo, Origination Inc., Novamil, Kemin, and PMI. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope that you consider them in your formulation decisions. I will now open the floor for questions. English language listeners, I will read your question. Remember to type your question in the Q&A tab or in the chat window. Thanks very much, and now we'll go over to the live part of the webinar. Dr. Wattiaux, hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
Doing fine, thank you.
Great. I usually have Elena Bonfante with me in the morning, but she's in Turkey, so she wasn't able to join today. I am waiting for some questions from our webinar attendees, but in the meantime, I do have some questions from Marcos Neves Piera, who is from UFLA, which I didn't talk about in our closing webinars because he's become our more predominant co-host in Brazil. Anyway, he sent me some questions because last time his sound didn't work so well, and I also have some that we talked about within our own office. As you maybe know, Caroline Rasmussen did some work on this excretion part of the model, the CNCPS model, and I think worked with you a little bit.
Yes.
So I have some questions, and let me know if it would be better for you if I shared them in a chat window so you can see and process as you answer. Some of them are the same. I'm going to combine them.
Okay.
So one of the questions from Caroline and also mirrored in Marcos was, where do methane digesters come into these analysis? And Marcos further said, they seem to be an option to deal with gas emissions. What are the new developments in this area, and how representative energy production can be sourced as an income on the farm?
Hmm. Yes, very good question. So I think as I try to provide some of the data, from the work that was done here in Wisconsin, Becky Larson and Horacio did the LCA, and Doug Renneman also, biological system engineering, seems to have really, their work seems to indicate that anaerobic digesters really have a great potential to compensate, right, through the generation of energy and the savings of the greenhouse gas produced in the local power plant, to compensate for the emissions from enterics and the other source of within the farm. I think it hasn't gone very much forward, with implementation on farms, although I know of two large biodigesters here in Wisconsin. And I think the reason that it hasn't really moved forward is simply because of the statewide and nationwide energy policies in the United States. In other words, power plant companies are in part private companies, and they have to make a profit and they have to make money, and so they want to sell electricity as much as they can. And in a way, if they have to spread their profits with dairy farmers who are supplying them, there is a whole new area of business management that needs to be put in place, and it hasn't occurred yet. I think that's one of the main reasons why it hasn't gone forward, is simply because economically, it's given the energy policies in place right now in the United States, there's no incentive, no economic advantage for the producers to really go ahead and start investing into anaerobic digester. As we go forward and we have more state mandate, and who knows, maybe nationwide mandate to rely on renewable energy, I think there is a fight, if I can use that word here, a fight to be fought in order to make room for anaerobic digestion as part of the sources of renewable energy. Compared to others. Each renewable energy source has advantages and disadvantages. And clearly the mix altogether should be considered.
Do you, in your studies, do you see a difference or maybe a different approach in other parts of the world, like Europe, for example?
I have only secondhand information about Europe. I do believe that there was an effort a few years ago to look into biodigesters. I believe in Germany they've really moved forward a lot with communal, collection center that then bring the manure to the biodigester, and it's help bring energy to a small town, to a village. I think they have a few examples of that. It's been very heavily subsidized, obviously, but that's because Germany, again, at the national level, as you may know, have basically decided to stop relying on nuclear energy, and try to be independent of fossil fuel. So they're really investing a lot into renewable energy. And so this is why this has been made possible in Germany in particular.
I think Italy may be doing quite a bit on that too.
Okay. Yes, I'm not aware of. I don't have contact in Italy, so I'm not in.
Well, I wish Eleanor were with us. She could speak to that.
Yeah. But there is another place where I spent some times, and it's in Costa Rica, and there I was kind of surprised to see how biodigesters, small units, are spread everywhere. If you are a dairy farmer in Costa Rica, and there are a lot of dairy farmers in Costa Rica, and you have 5 cows or more, you're going to have a biodigester. Obviously, it doesn't produce a lot of energy, but it does contribute to the supply of energy on the farm. And so why does it work in Costa Rica, and why in the US, it doesn't seem to have taken hold? I think it's because of a different perspective on what that technology does, for the producer. Again, I think in the US, the economics are against, the adoption of that technology, whereas in Costa Rica, again, there was a lot of effort to help producers to be as environmentally friendly as they could and benefit from it, make win-win situation. And for them, it was no brainer that biodigesters, small scale biodigesters, for auto consumption, right? They're not trying to sell the energy back to the grid in Costa Rica. They just use it for themselves. For them, it's a no brainer.
Well, this sort of leads into some other questions and a little bit of maybe political discussion. Assuming future policymakers do not believe that climate change is a hoax, does it make sense that future regulations or incentives will be crafted to change farm practices to limit carbon emissions? That's a loaded question and probably hard to answer.
Yeah. So will we be going, if I paraphrase the question in my own words, will we be going towards regulation of carbon balance, on the farm? Well, I think there is some precedent that we can look at independently of, political situation here. Nutrient balance, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, we know there are large excess of those on farms, which at the farm level, the system level, is a concern, economically and environmentally for the producer. And what's the difference with carbon? If carbon now has been recognized as having undesirable effect when it's released to the atmosphere, just like nitrogen was recognized as having some undesirable effect after it was released in water and air. Same thing with phosphorus. Then it seems to me like a good place to see where we're going to go down in the road in the future with the carbon is looking at where we've been and where we're going with the nitrogen and the phosphorus issues. And so I think, again, different parts of the world have taken different approaches to dealing with that issue. Some more top down, and others more like laissez-faire, to use the French expression.
This is a little bit of a, probably maybe this hasn't been done yet, but do you foresee it? Obviously, sometimes the solution offered is to move to a more plant-based diet, including the inclusions of plant-based milk type products. Has there been, or do you anticipate studies that show sort of the net carbon footprint of actually the natural method of milk production and obtaining it from non-animals? And, it would seem a complete analysis of that should include the loss of the animals used to process the byproducts of for example, almond milk production.
Right. So again, there's many parts of this question. I will start with the fact that I think one place where the dairy industry should fight, that's my personal opinion, is whatever it's plant-based is not milk. The word milk, I think the dairy industry all over the world should fight to make milk a word that should refer to the product of the mammary gland of a mammalian animal. And if it's plant-based, it should be called something else, whatever they want to call it, but don't call it milk. It's, this is very, very critical, I think. Everybody know tequila and Jalisco. Everybody know champagne and champagne. And so I think, the denomination, the name needs to be preserved. That's the first thing I would say. Now, you may be aware that Robin White and Virginia Tech and Mary Beth Hall here in Madison worked together and published a paper in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Science just a year or two ago, where they basically tried to simulate the impact of removing livestock, all the livestocks, dairy and beef, from U.S. agriculture, and try to see the impact that this would have in terms of how land use would change. Obviously, because now we don't use the land to produce feed for livestock, we would use the land to feed food for humans directly. And the impact on the quality of the nutrients that agriculture would provide, to feed the population. And as kind of no surprise for those who know a little about nutrition, when you go from an animal-based to a plant-based diet, vitamin B12 and some of the essential fatty acids are becoming deficient very quickly. And so you need to be very careful, that if you go that route, that, you're a lot more cautious, and you may be, and do we want to go in a world where people, eat certain things and then they need to take supplements to know that their diet is kind of balanced? Personally, I don't like that idea. We're the product of millions of years of evolution. Our digestive system is, and I think it's by eating a variety and a diverse set of food ingredients that we balance our diet, and not, I would hate to rely on the large company selling me vitamin B12 to know that I'm eating healthy. I don't like that idea.
Good, thank you. Yes, I was actually at a conference where Mary Beth presented that, and I was hoping she might join us with some questions today, but there's still this evening. Let's see, another question. Forage NDF increases the acetate to propionate ratio of ruminal fluid more than non-forage fiber sources of NDF. Low forage diets with high inclusion of NFFS would be an effective way of exploring the fiber digestibility capacity of ruminants, and at the same time reducing methane emission per unit of milk. That's a question, actually. Would this type of diet be the diet of future high-producing dairy cows?
So if I understand well, the question is whether a low forage NDF with a lot of non-forage fiber would be the way forward. Yeah,
I'm going to copy it for you in the chat window so that you can look at it.
Sure. If I interpreted the question correctly, the short answer would be yes.
Okay.
Yes, so I'm going to read it again here. So forage NDF increases the acetate to propionate ratio in ruminal fluid more than non-forage fiber source NDF. Low forage NDF with high inclusion of, so it's non-forage fiber sources.
Yes.
Would be an effective way to exploring the fiber digesting capacity of ruminant and at the same time reducing methane emission per unit of milk. Would this type of diet be the diet of? I think it would be. I think it's a good way forward. Yes, actually, we're just in the process. We just submitted a paper to Journal of Dairy Science where we looked at both the source of NDF from alfalfa silage or from corn silage and the level of NDF. So a 19% forage NDF diet and a 24% forage NDF diet. And so instead, to not repeat what had been done before, we basically made sure that the starch was identical in those diets. And so what was different because, right, if you put more of something, you're going to have to put less of something else. So when we had more NDF, forage NDF, when we have more forage NDF, we had less non-forage NDF, right? And so, and vice versa. And the source of non-forage NDF was soy hulls. And what we observed was that it was not as much the forage NDF itself that made a difference. It was the change in probably rate of passage of that NDF through the rumen that allowed for higher dry matter intake on the diet with more soy hulls. And so all the result that we obtained from that study needed to be interpreted in not as much in the light of what happened in the rumen with methane emission in terms of, you know, the source of this methane and which carbohydrate it's coming from, but more from the fact that those cows were actually processing more feed. They were eating higher level of dry matter, they were producing more, and so methane per unit of milk was decreased in those diets. Again, not as much, we believe, because of what exactly happened in the rumen, but more simply because, again, that diet made the cow eat more and produce more.
Yeah. Question, would, to get a more complete picture, would you have to examine sort of the sources of those non-forage fiber sources and perhaps the what they're generating in their production? Because quite often, as you said, there's soy hulls,
yes,
almond hulls, things like that.
Yes, I think it's a worthy thing to do. But again, in my experience working with, you know, methane emission for the last 10 years and how to manipulate diet to help reduce methane emission, there's so many interactions between individual feed ingredients that pinpointing, you know, a feed will do this or a feed will do that, you know, it's very dangerous to do, because depending on what else is in the diet, that feed may end up having a different effect overall.
Right. It's the butterfly effect.
Yeah. That's what you call it? Okay.
I think so. You know, butterfly beats its wings in the Amazon and whatever happens.
Yeah.
Another question on the forage and concentrate ratios. The impact of forage concentrate ratios and feed efficiency on emissions is interesting. Was any economic or farm profitability analysis also done in conjunction with these studies? And what was the impact on farm profit or income over feed costs?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had worked with extension people who could have done, and ag economists who could have done those calculations for us and with us.
There's still time.
Yes, there's still time. That's a good idea. I'll make a note of that. Push the pencil down on those. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, it hasn't been done. What I will say, however, is that we do have producers here in Wisconsin who are not even waiting, you know, for economists to tell them. They just go ahead and focus on feed efficiency, you know, as a way to maximize income over feed cost. They caught on with that idea. Gee, if I get as much milk as I can at the lowest possible cost to my ration, that's my economic sustainability down the road. So I know that there are producers who are really focusing on feed efficiency extremely acutely these days.
So feed efficiency and energy corrected milk, how do different animal breeds feed into that?
So actually, again, you were asking a question that that experiment that I just mentioned, we just submitted to Journal of Dairy Science. It just so happened that we actually did everything with 12 Jerseys and everything with 12 Holsteins.
Oh, cool.
I think, you know, it'll be interesting when it comes out. So obviously, and so we did that in part because there were some papers from Denmark in particular, that seems to highlight some differences between the Holstein and Jerseys in terms of efficiency of chewing, efficiency of digestibility of the fiber in particular, and then some nitrogen use efficiency differences between the two breeds. So we decided it was worth to look into it. And basically what we found was, obviously when you look at amount per day, the Holsteins is about 30% higher than the Jerseys for about everything except fat protein corrected milk, where the difference is much less, because obviously the Jersey produce a milk that's more concentrated in components, but the Jerseys doesn't and produce the same level of fat corrected milk as the Holstein would. But so amount per day, you got that big difference related to body size, basically. But when we look at all the efficiency measures, so now we take the amount per day and we divide that by a certain denominator, there was no difference whatsoever. So if we were to take a nitrogen intake, nitrogen in the milk divided by nitrogen intake, there was no difference whatsoever between the two breeds. If we looked at, the partition of energy between, digestible energy and metabolizable energy in methane, as a proportion of the total energy consumed by the cow, it didn't make any difference. So our most recent data here it seems to indicate that there are actually relatively few differences between Jerseys and Holsteins.
What if you, I'm just wondering if you throw in the agronomic aspect, does that provide any differences? Just both.
In terms of the breed?
Yeah.
That's a good question. That's a very good question, actually. And I don't know of any studies that really look at that. Well, I'll take it back. And again, it was a study from Italy that I just noticed recently, where they basically suggested that the carbon footprint of the milk of the Jersey would be less than the carbon footprint of milk from the Holsteins, not as much because of the concentration of nutrients in the milk of the Jersey, but rather because the Jersey is more fertile. She doesn't have
they're working on that.
Well, there you go.
I think the Holstein breed's really working on increasing fertility, and the Jersey breed seems to sadly be decreasing fertility.
Yeah, well, that's to their, that may become a problem at some point.
Yeah.
But and so yeah, I think so. If you talk of tying, and we need so much more research at the system level, because I think you bring up a very good question. If you bring the land base into the equation here, well, the first point of departure for us to think about is, okay, well, let's think of real farm. They have lands and they have a dairy herd. The first question is, what's the ratio, between the two? What's the animal unit per hectare? Does this farm has a lot of land and a relatively few animals? In other words, from a perspective of feed supply, forage supply, grain supply for that matter, right? They could produce their own corn and feed that corn. They're completely independent from outside sources. Or are we dealing with a situation where we have very little land and a lot of cows, where now the producers are completely dependent on outside sources to feed the herd, and then they have to deal with the manure also in other ways. And so I think there are so few studies that deal with a better understanding of those dynamics. And now, to add another layer here, think about what the difference would be if your land is basically pasture land or grazed land versus, again, crops, corn and other forages. To be stored. So I think we need to have more people thinking and working at the system level than we've seen in the recent past.
Yes, and there's also other layers of when you get to even the structure size that you need comparatively, how many animals you can fit in a set space.
Right.
It's just there's no one thing you can look at, and I think if I remember right, Mary Beth Hall's paper was sort of like, yeah, we're just looking at it from we're just skimming all of the possibilities.
Yes, yes. Definitely.
Well, let's see. I have one other question I'll ask. I have some more questions, but I'll throw them to tonight's discussion.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of people that indicated they wanted to join, but most likely are going to listen to the recording, so they get the questions in the recording.
Sure.
Did the Cheddarberg and Matson comparison of conventional to organic include the carbon needed for sourcing of purchased feeds, additional tillage associated with organic systems?
I would have to go back and check those. That's again a good question, and I can try to kind of bring that up right in the conclusion of my presentation there. I mean, it seems like, and there was purposefully that I actually on the slides, showed the models that were published as a figure. You could look at slide 30, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me know when I get close, because I mess up your count.
So it's one back from that one. Here we go. Yeah. So this is, I just did this as an example, right? So a study, well, this is the physio study. We could actually, let me see, I'm also checking the slides here to see the Berks. Yeah. I mean, they are, pretty much, the point is the same, that here's an example of, comparing two systems, one in Sweden, one in New Zealand. And so clearly the authors tried to do their best to show that they were trying to compare apple to apple, right? Displaying the model that they use. And that's one of my points here about the LCA. You can try to make things look like apple to apple, but even the fact, if you analyze those two graphs, you'll see a lot of similarities, and then you'll see some differences. Are those the real important differences between the two systems? Where did we draw the line in one and not in the other? And a lot of those papers, when they are written, those details are not, in the paper itself. So we have to go with what the authors are telling us, and so we don't know more often than not, which is a problem, right? Because and I mean, I'll share this with the audience here. I'm sure that everyone know of the IFSM model and Al Roth's. It's not that I was taken aback, but I it was just 6 months ago at the Dairy Science meeting when I talked with Al, and I asked him a question about LCA, and then he stopped me and said, "Well, Michel, but you can say anything you want with LCA, right? You understand that." So.
And it looks like we haven't even had a discussion yet of the end use of the milk, whether it's going into cheese or into products rather than as a fluid milk.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Yeah, it's again so many layers.
Yes, definitely.
Well, Michel, thank you so much. I think not to take up too much of your time this morning, to save some time for this afternoon. Going to appreciate everybody that attended live and hope that they got some really good information. Again, we're recording all of this, so these questions will be up at the end of both webinars, probably tomorrow or Monday, so that people can listen to the recorded webinars. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'll see you tonight, Michel.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye for the morning.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's see. So I'm going to switch out so that we can have the slides available if we need to move to another slide. And I'm going to, let's see, have Paula unmute herself. Michel, when you came in, I muted you, so welcome.
Okay.
You're unmuted now.
Okay, perfect.
All right, good. Paula, if you have some questions, I'm going to let you start it off. If you don't, I have some questions that I can draw upon too. So just let me know what you would prefer.
Hi.
Slide to explain. Hi, Paula.
Hi, Michel. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Paula. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I have one question or comment from Gonzalo. He is saying that it seems more complex than what he thought. So, what do you think we as consultants or nutritionists can start recommending to our producers? Here in Argentina, the intensifying systems are increasing. So, what would be the most the focus or the priority to say to them, just in base of the information there is today?
Mm-hmm. So I may ask you to try to help clarify a little bit here. So, I mean, what the recommendation that you make to producers kind of depend on what kind of objective you have. So, what educational goals would you have as a consultant? What do you think the producers need to be aware of? In order to make recommendation, right? You have to have a problem, right, that you want to solve. So what do you think the problem for the Argentinian producers are in the context of greenhouse gas emission? Is there a problem to begin with? I mean, is it something, you know, that they should be worrying about? Is it something that you as consultant should just tell them something about? I don't know. I mean, maybe there are things in Argentina. I mean, I don't know the context of Argentina really well. You know, in the U.S., just to elaborate a little bit on what I'm trying to convey to you here is that, as you probably know, there's a lot of concern overall, right, about greenhouse gas emission in the United States and its impact globally. But, you know, the U.S. dairy industry has committed to reducing milk carbon footprint, you know, substantially, and, you know, coming with very concrete goals of, you know, 25% reduction in 10 years, you know, and this was like 5-6 years ago. But overall, the facts, the best facts that we have to date would indicate that the dairy industry as a whole in the United States contribute barely 2% of all the greenhouse gas emitted in the country. So you can think of it as a big environmental problem, the methane produced by dairy cow, and the media made you think of it that way. You know, it's a very easy target. But the reality is it's such a small component of the total that it really doesn't matter. So there are much more important problem to deal with nationwide than to you know, to tell dairy farmers that they should change their practice to reduce greenhouse gas emission.
Do you think, though, this comes back to the slide you had on consumer perception? What in your mind can farmers do to change that? Because there is so much focus on the dairy producer or the animal protein as a source of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, you know, public image is key, right? So what can producers do? I mean, if you know, if anything they can do to convey the impression that they are good steward of the land. It used to be that, right? It used to be a generation or 2 or 3 generations ago where no one worried about what the farmers were doing on the land, because the assumption was the farmer is taking care of the land, taking care of the animals and the crops the best to his or her ability. You know, today's world is different. So I think, yes, there is a lot more scrutiny of the public at large on what's going on farms. And so if a farmer can demonstrate that they're really paying attention to animal welfare, that they do pay attention to environmental issues, and they want to know what the consumer wants so that they can better serve the consumer, I think that's you know, a win-win situation for the farmers as well as for the consumers, for that matter.
Very good. Paula, I'm going to take a turn at a question and then we'll come back to you. Here's a question. What novel feed additives have consistent data supporting their use as strategies to control methane and nitric oxide emissions? Could you comment on tannins, essential oils, probiotics, etc.?
Okay, yeah, so there's a long list of different products that have been tested, right? And so I really don't have the background to take them one by one and tell you, yes, no, or 5% or 10%. I mean, with what we understand of rumen metabolism, any product that will tend to alter the pattern of fermentation right towards more propionic acid, so more concentrate type based diet, the more you're going to tend to reduce emission. Up to recently, to share with you my own biases, up to very recently, although they've been Europeans and works from around the parts of the world that look at existing product, right, like monensin, and they do contribute to reducing methane emission to a certain degree. But I don't think that the contribution is very substantial, and so I really didn't believe that it would be feasible to find a product that really had a big impact on rumen microbiome and alter the population of microbes in the rumen in order to reduce the emission. And the one product that seems to be really emerging with a substantial effect that seems to be pretty consistent is the 3-NOP product that ADM, I think, is now still testing in different parts of the world, as I understand it. But Alex Herstoff has published some work in Proceeding of National Academy of Science showing 30% reduction with the NOP, which I had never seen that before. So there is hope to come up with a very unique product that reduces the methane. When it comes to the tannin, we've done some work, and again, there's so many different types of tannins that have so many different mode of actions. So I think some of them work, some of them don't. I think everyone needs to do their homework to find out, what real science has been behind some of the claims made by some companies.
So it seems sometimes like it's a little bit of a catch-22. If we want a ruminant to behave like a ruminant, we're potentially causing her to have more emissions. Yet if we want her to, if we feed her like a monogastric, like they do, like feedlot cows are, there's fewer emissions, correct? Or am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. So basically, when you think about it, the ecological niche of a ruminant is to utilize fiber, which monogastric animal cannot utilize, and that's the price to pay. You got the methane coming out, and it's the price to pay because again, people are concerned about greenhouse gases emission, and this is a recent a recent phenomena in society that people say, whoops, we are getting in trouble because we're emitting all those greenhouse gases. But in an ideal world, in my view, it's not about getting rid of ruminant animals. It's really about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of livestock agriculture and ruminant agriculture in particular, right? And I know that in Europe, for example, there've been very interesting work from my perspective where they actually try to look at livestock agriculture, and depending on the way you feed those animals, the question that was raised in those articles was, do livestock agriculture really contribute to a net supply of not just protein eatable by humans, but the limiting amino acids, in the human diets when that diet is primarily based on plant product. So I'm talking about lysine and methionine in particular. And so again, it's and some of the answer was, as always, well, it depends. It depends how you feed the animals. Sometimes the livestock can be a positive contributor to lysine and methionine supply to society as a whole, and sometimes it's not. And it's those studies are very difficult to conduct, to make, because of the assumptions that you have to make when you make those kind of modeling.
Thank you. I'm going to give Paula a chance. She's got quite a backlog of questions going. So Paula, if you want to go ahead and start tackling, I see at least 3 that you have ready to be asked. So go ahead.
Here, the first question is from Ivan from Chile. He wants to know if there is any study considering profitability of the dairy farm also.
In relation, in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, you mean?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. I'm trying to think on my feed here. So no, I don't think so. I'm trying to force myself to think maybe of a paper that was published a few years ago that worked on in Germany, where they tried to look through databases of farm practices, and from those databases of farm practices, they evaluated the environmental impact, and one of those indicators was greenhouse gas emission. And on the other hand, they had the economic databases of the same farm, so the profitability. And the researchers were trying to see if there was an association, a correlation between higher profitability and low or high environmental impact. And I think, the overall trend was that in general, it was a positive relationship between the two. In other words, the farms that were the more profitable in general were the farms that had a lower environmental impact. And I think, if I remember correctly, the conclusion or the speculation of the authors was that when you have good managers who are trying to use their resources more efficiently, you end up with better outcome economically, and you have less negative outcome environmentally.
Okay, yes, thank you. The other question from Ivan also, do you think a partial mixed ration system could be better than TMR, or on the other side, considering a total grazing system?
Again, in terms of emission of greenhouse gases?
Yes.
Okay, so grazing will lead to more methane per unit of dry matter intake, no question about that, compared to a mixed diet. But as I tried to indicate in the presentation, right, the answer to that question kind of depends. What is your concern? Is it total emission per unit of day per time, or is it emission per kilos of milk? Right? You have lower dry matter intake, and you have lower yield of milk on pasture than you do with total mixed ration. So it makes your intensity, so the emission per kilos of milk, higher on grazing system than you have in conventional system. So if your goal is to reduce the emission per kilos of milk, your best approach would be to go with total mixed ration or partial mixed ration. The reason is primarily because you will have so much more milk that when you take your emission and divide it by the amount of milk, you are better off with TMR or partial TMR than you are with grazing.
Great. And the last question is from Leo. He has been with us in Wisconsin in June.
Yes.
So he wants to know, in the US and Europe, are governments thinking of banning the use of antibiotics that reduce methane production?
Well, I would have to I would have to double check, what Leo is referring to here in terms of antibiotic reducing greenhouse gas emission. I had never heard of that before. But separately, the ban on antibiotic, my understanding is that the Europeans are very aggressive in maybe not, an outright ban on antibiotic, but it seems like, I was in Europe recently, back in my home farm in Belgium, and my brother was just indicating how difficult it was to get antibiotic for the herd, whether it's dry cow therapy or other form of antibiotic, and it doesn't seems to be through the rules and the regulation, but simply that companies, for some reason, seems to be out of stock. So I don't know what's going on exactly in Europe, but I know that it's becoming more and more difficult for farmers to get access to antibiotic in Europe. And I know in the United States now that there is a lot of very serious work about, banning it. But there is obviously, as you know, a lot of resistance from the beef industry in particular that depends so heavily on that antibiotic to help, with the feed efficiency of the animals. But I think, again, this is, I see it as something that's inevitable is going to happen one way or the other. It's either the industry going to adopt it voluntarily, or it's going to be forced upon them at some point down the road.
Marian, may I go? I have another one.
Yes. Why don't you go ahead? You're on a roll.
Okay. The question is, do you think it would be the same for a beef farm, considering pasture or versus feedlot systems?
That's a good question. I remember looking at some of the studies that kind of compared, and very honestly, I don't remember what the outcome was. But the difference between the two, here's the way to think about it. The feedlot system is a system that really speed up, right, the growth of the animal, right? Depending exactly how the system works, right? It's 6 months, 8 months in pasture, cow, calf, and then the last 6 months on the feedlot. If you have more conventional system, the animal is going to take more time to reach slaughter weight. And that additional time, as I remember, was really the Achilles tendon of the grass, fed beef system. Simply because you have more days to bring the animal to slaughter weight, and all those greenhouse gas emission during those days, was really more. Caused a higher emission for that system than the system of the feedlot. So I think, yes, the answer is that now that I've tried to think through that question again, the feedlot system would be a lower emitting system than the grass-based systems.
Okay, thank you, Paula. I'm going to ask if you have, let's see, we'll come back to that question you just put in. And then I'll ask a couple of questions, and while Michel's answering them, I'll look at that one. Let's see, I have one. Did the variability within farm system is really a problem and an opportunity? Are you planning future research that will identify what farms on both sides of the CO2 emissions per kilogram of the energy corrected milk curve are doing. I think that harkens back to the slide that you had with I think it was New Zealand and Sweden.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll move to that too while you start to answer.
Sure. Yeah. And I think the answer is, as of now, I do not have the funding to do that research. But I'm hoping, I'm actively involved in some research project where this is some of the things that we are interested in proposing to get funding to do. And as you can realize by now, right, my thinking here is that although a lot of people talk about system, organic and grazing or conventional, when it comes to greenhouse gases emission, because you have so many different sources on the farm, that it's more like practice that matters. The feeding practice, the cropping practices, the manure management practices, those are, to me, more critical to understand how we can use those practices to help ourselves, rather than thinking of trying to compare organic versus grazing or grazing versus conventional.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and ask the question that Paula has, and I'm not sure that you're going to be able to handle this. The person we probably need to answer is Tom Tolucci. Okay. But perhaps, I don't remember if you've played around in our software enough to know. Okay. In our software, in AMTS, we have an indicator of methane megajoules and methane liters. Do you, is it possible to formulate for a specific goal on those values? It's fine to say that you're not familiar with the software to answer that.
Yeah, I don't know enough AMTS to really answer that question, yes or no. From a modeling, a model building standpoint, there is no reason why you would not be able to do it. It's just like, you're trying to formulate a diet, for whatever goal you may have, and you build your model accordingly. And you could build a model very easily to try to minimize or target a certain, megajoule of energy in the form of methane based on the prediction equation that we have and our understanding of ruminant physiology. We could model that and build model around it. Now, if AMTS is able to do that or not at this point, I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I think we had a discussion about this actually yesterday in the office, and not entirely sure how the sensitivity of that equation and what's feeding into it. But
yes.
I think that it might be a very interesting sort of, I could do a blog post about it. I might, Michel, I might send you the program and say, why don't you, if you have time, take a look at it and let us know what you think. It would be a really neat follow-up to this talk.
Okay.
All right. Let's see, Paula, unless you have another question right away, I'll go ahead and ask one of the ones that Marcos sent me from Brazil. Let's see. I think we sort of tackled the question of low forage diets and high producing cows, and what you think. I'm trying to see if there's anything that we didn't really already cover in a question already.
Well, what I'll say is, I remember when I used to do talk for producers earlier in my career, and even before people were worried about greenhouse gases, I always said that the secret was really to formulate diet that cows like to eat. And I think for greenhouse gases emission, in a way, it's not very different. From a producer perspective, the more you can make your cow efficient in terms of feed efficiency, you know, how much milk you get per kilos of dry matter intake, the less, the more environmentally friendly you can claim to be.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you or not, because that's also, I think, an interesting thing to think about. And you know, at what level do we need to tackle the greenhouse gas emission, right? You can tackle it at the level of the rumen, right? Trying to go after enteric emission. You can tackle it at the level of the cow. If you go at the level of the cow, well, then it's enteric emission for the cow proper, but now you got the manure from the cow, right? And if you say, okay, the cow and the manure of the cow, now the manure will have some nitrous oxide emission associated with it as you're going to go through the storing and the manure management chain. So now it's a different story, right? If you go at the cow level, now you can go at the farm level, and now you're talking of incorporating the emission from the crops all together, and then you can go kind of regionally or nationally, right? The national emission from the dairy industry. And again, when I was in Europe earlier this year, it was interesting to see how much work is being done to try to understand how to optimize the emission, if I can use that word, depending on the type of region of the country that you are in. So let me try to give you a very clear example, and I'll take an example that Wisconsin example. One side of the state is you know, flat, so large scale agriculture can take place because you can have large pieces of equipment on the land, and so this is where we have all of our large dairy farms, you know, 2,000, 4,000 dairy cow operation with very intensive conventional system. Another side of the state is the state where there are a lot of hills, and so basically, you know, the best use of the land is really grazing, because you cannot go with your tractors on your field because it's too dangerous, and for one thing. And then, you know, if you were to plow that land, it would be a lot of soil erosion and nutrient loss and all this kind of thing. So the system that you have in place, right, needs to reflect the natural environment in which the farm is located. And so it's not like one solution for all. Is that we should be able, and I think this is probably the way of the future in terms of research, again, is given a particular set of natural resources that the farm is given, you know, what would be bearable, expectable level of emission? How low can you go in those contexts? You know, in contrast to other systems where the landscape and the land is different, and therefore you can have different practices on the land that will give you different emission. But again, in each case, you would want to reduce the emission, but the expectation of how much you can reduce that emission can be very different based on the region that you are.
Mm. Well, and I think, you know, thinking of it in terms of that, it's also reliant that hand in hand with that goes some strong consumer education in terms of when you mention that 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions is responsible from, I think I have that number stuck in my head, is what is responsible in the U.S.
Correct.
That's a small portion, but the perceived amount of damage that it is happening is much larger. So again, we have to, as the number of farmers decrease, the understanding of the farming practices will coordinately decrease.
Correct. Exactly. And I don't know why, honestly. You know, when you listen to the news and follow, I mean, I'm not on social media, but, you know, I'm follow the news, and you keep hearing, you know, agriculture is as a whole, worldwide, is responsible for 25% of all the greenhouse gases emission. And then that's the starting point. And then the next point is, well, it's because beef. It's because, and the reason is because some of those studies and reports are, again, FAO type reports that look at all countries together, and they are concerned about, primarily actually, deforestation. This is actually a lot of the 25% that they are talking about. A big portion of it is actually associated with the cutting of forest and the burning of those trees, rather than just the livestock proper. So again, when you look at worldwide issue, maybe the livestock industry has a substantial carbon footprint, and it's not as much because of the livestock itself, but more because of the deforestation that takes place. And again, the livestock industry are very easily blamed for deforestation. But the soybean, I mean, we may have, I'm sorry if I'm going to hurt the feeling on some, Brazilian soybean producer here, but they cut the tree. The people who cut the trees are people who wants to sell wood. Those are the first people who go in the forest to get the wood. But again, this is lost, right? For some reason in the media, all you see is, farmers in Brazil are going and cutting the forest to grow beef, and it's completely inaccurate, completely wrong. But yet this is what you keep hearing. And then one final point is, right, as I said, the starting number is like 20-25%, and then they dive in, that we need to really change our feeding system because of that. But it means that there is another 75 to 80% that people don't seem to be worried about.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I just feel like we need to be ahead of the curve and be ready for whatever eventually the regulations I think will come.
Yes.
And
yes.
so
I don't think we need to be apologetic. But I think we need to help. There's a lot of education definitely that needs to be taking place. And I think, again, the industry and the farmers in particular can go, can really contribute to creating the connection with the consumer, as I tried to say at the end of my presentation, is
key. Yeah.
Is really key. Yes.
Yeah. Paula, how are you on questions? Do you have any more from Argentina?
No, I don't.
Okay. I think we probably should let everybody know or let everybody go and enjoy the rest of their evening. Michel, thank you so much. This is a topic that's very dear to my heart. Caroline and I were both like, yeah, we need to talk about this more. So we're so glad we could get you to talk. And I will send you, I'll send you the program so that you can maybe play around with it and let me know what you get out of it. There was a paper you referenced that Paula was asking if it would be possible to get a link to or a copy of the paper. It was a few questions ago, and I'm not sure which one it is. Paula, do you have in mind which one? About profitability, yes.
Yes, the European one. I think it was from Germany.
Okay, that European one, yes, that German. I make a note of that and try to dig it out. And do I email it to you, Marianne?
If you email it to me, and if you don't mind, I'll put a link in the email that I send out to everybody when I let them know the recordings are available.
Yep.
That'll be fantastic.
Sure.
All right. Very good. Are we all good, Paula?
Yes. Thank you very much, Michel.
No, it's a pleasure, Paula. I hope everything's going right for you down there.
Yes. I prefer you talking in Spanish, but it's okay.
Well,
it would be a struggle for me. I'm pathetic.
Yes, I know. But easier for us.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Michel. I will be in touch.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.